So there is a strong misconception when we mention the term gender. There's a strong misconception in which gender is relates to women's issues only, but this is actually a wrong misconception. So when we're talking of gender, simply issues to do with men and women. So gender is determined by the conception of tasks, functions, and roles that are attributed to men and women in society. We are simply saying there are roles between men and women that have become socially acceptable. So those are what we term gender roles. So some may ask, why gender when we're talking of climate change? I think it's important to incorporate gender in issues of climate change because it has been discovered that the impact of climate change are not equitable between men and women. Climate change actually affects men and women differently, hence the need to push such conversations to do with gender when we're talking of the subject of climate change. So the effects of climate change are also contextual. Vulnerability to we had talking of vulnerability to climate change. So also, in terms of gender, when we talk of gender, vulnerability to the impact of climate change depends on several factors, which include gender, age, socioeconomic status, and disability. Climate change affects both women's and men's ability to secure their livelihoods. Also, it poses new challenges for the agricultural sector in reducing poverty and food insecurities. Further on, climate change is likely to exacerbate inequalities between women and men. So what the impact of climate change actually does is that it worsens the inequalities that exist between men and women in society. So the relationship between gender and climate change needs to be explored, looking at how and why women and men are differently affected by climate change. And it is crucial that such inequalities are addressed so that equitable policies and mechanisms can then be affected when addressing the impact of climate change in local societies and also at the national level. So for the purposes of this presentation, I've identified 4 broad areas that women face with regards to the impact of climate change. So firstly, with food security, secondly, water and energy sources, then climate-induced natural disasters, then climate-induced migration. So in terms of food security, crop failure as a result of sporadic rainfall brought about by the climate change may result in selective malnourishment of women and girls, especially in cultures where men are used to eating before girls. So actually what happens is that women have less economic resources to fall back on in times of drought, in times of crises. So you actually find that women are negatively affected more compared to men. Also, related increase in food prices impact negatively on women. Further on, women face the negative economic implications of crop failure as they usually have fewer economic resources to fall back on in times of crisis. For example, in rural areas, women own livestock such as chicken, goats, And these are usually the first to be sold in times of crisis, droughts. And it's rare for men to sell such animals as cattle. So that affects negatively on women as well. Although women play a critical role in farming, they don't enjoy the same privileges and rights as men. For example, men typically rear the most profitable animals and grow the most valued crops, while women face many obstacles to own land and have the added responsibility of managing the entire household. Further on, women are forced, like I mentioned earlier, women are forced to sell off assets to fend off families due to their role as managers of the domestic household. Also, it can be noted that men hardly sell their productive assets. It's usually the chickens, the goats, of which these are the assets that are owned mostly by women. So that's the first item in terms of food security. Then secondly, in terms of water and energy sources also, that's another broad challenge that poses as a problem for women in relation to the impact of climate change. So women and girls face vulnerabilities resulting from cultural norms and their lower socio-economic status in society. Women's domestic roles often make them disproportionate users of natural resources, such as water and firewood. And as these become scarcer, women experience an increased work burden and may fall further into poverty. Women have to walk longer distances to fetch water, especially in rural areas. As a result, women have less time for other domestic responsibilities, decreasing their productive capacity, and also the time to learn other skills or to simple rest as normal human beings. Also, in terms of water and energy, you find that in urban centers, it is women who have this burden of searching for water. And we all know the water crisis, especially coming from Harare, perennial water problems over the years due to climate change. It's women who bear the brunt of this problem. Furthermore, water from distant sources is rarely enough to meet the needs of households and is often contaminated. It is also women who are at the receiving end of poor sanitation as managers of the household. Also, as women walk long distances in search of water, sexual assault and harassment becomes a big risk. I don't know if any of you in the media fraternity followed closely the story of Chitungi's water barons and of late Epworth water barons. There's surprisingly we have cash barons and water barons as well. So there are those water barons in Chitungiza who prey on young girls. It is these young girls who are found at these water points searching for water. So what actually happens is water barons, they control these water holes and they sell water to these young girls and they end up sexually abusing these young girls. Also, increased workload may result in families withdrawing girls from school to help out at home, especially in rural areas, thus reducing their future opportunities. So that circle of disempowerment actually continues and worsens due to the impact of climate change. So this is actually a pictorial representation of, I am sure some of you have seen all these scenes in local communities, long queue of women with buckets, jigubu, all that stuff. Next slide. This, shall we see a woman as well? Next. Also, this is also a cluster of girls and women at a water point, a long queue as well. This is also another pictorial representation of girls walking from quite a distance, huge load of firewood on their heads. So all these images portray the impact of climate change on women. Also, for the third broad sector that I'm looking at in terms of the challenges faced by women due to the impact of climate change, climate-induced natural disasters. Natural disasters also have a gendered implications, killing more women than men. In time, due to their physical nature, in times of natural disasters, for example, cyclones, men can actually flee, climb into trees. Well, while women are are not that physically able to flee. So you discover that in times of natural disasters, more women die compared to men. Also, increased morbidity and mortality from climate change affects women more. The role of women as primary caregivers is intensified, potentially leading to exhaustion and illness. Also, women have less access to medical services than men. Climate change actually worsens the situation. This is due to the poor socio-economic status of women in society. They have less access to medical facilities. So you find out that in times of crisis, they have lower access to access medical services. Epidemics such as cholera worsens women's sanitation and hygiene. For example, the famous 2008 cholera in parts of Bolivia and Plainview, women are mostly at the receiving end of such diseases that are brought about by the impact of climate change. Then lastly, the fourth broad factor that I'm looking at is climate-induced migration. Men are often in a better position to migrate and move away from the impact of climate change. For example, in times of droughts, men can actually move away, maybe into cities or out of the country, while women are less likely to move as primary caregivers. So the impact of climate change is actually negatively affecting women more. Also, can you please go? Women as primary caregivers are less likely to migrate as they are affected negatively by the impact of climate change. Then there's actually a need for a gender sensitive response to the effects of climate change. Despite the vulnerabilities experienced by women and girls, they are often unable to voice their specific needs. So what it actually means is that women as custodians of primary custodians of natural resources, they have extensive knowledge of the environment, and this knowledge is untapped for as unable to voice their specific needs. So there is a need for efforts to integrate gender concerns in climate change responses, which is largely neglected. The ability of women to manage climate crisis is constrained by an equitable distribution of rights, resources and power. Also, policies and practices for mitigation and adaptation strategies have failed to incorporate gender mainstreaming. We're simply saying gender mainstreaming, looking at the different roles that men and women play in society. So I think policies that mitigate and adapt to climate change are failing. They need to incorporate gender mainstreaming policies for effective implementation of climate adaptation and mitigation strategies. Women and men are not helpless victims of climate change, but use various methods and strategies to adapt change. So there is need to actually involve both men and women and strategies in an equitable manner, the strategies that impact the effects of climate change. Effective climate change adaptation recognizes that women and men and children experience impacts differently depending on where they live, how they sustain their livelihoods, and the roles that they play in their families and communities. So there are some recommended approaches for integrating gender and climate change. So first, there is a need for gender responsive approach, which understands socially constructed roles and opportunities associated with being a man and a woman, and the interactions and unequal social relations between men and women. The focus should be on challenging these inequalities as a means to reduce the negative impacts of climate change and creating more effective responses as an end in itself. Also, as a recommendation, a thorough consideration of key issues such as gender roles, norms, and unequal power relations, and how these will be addressed. Moreover, addressing the gender dimensions of climate change and its responses entails working with men, women, boys, and girls. So it's not only, we're not only saying in terms of gender, let's talk of women. We're saying let's involve both men and women in an equitable manner. Let's find out what impacts who and in what ways more, and come up with policies that effectively deals with both men, women, boys, and girls. Involve women in vulnerability assessments to ensure that evaluations do not focus solely on economic sectors dominated by men. We're simply saying involve women also, so that we don't have a one-size-fits-all approach to the effects, to the impacts of climate change. That involve both men and women for a holistic approach to manage the effects of climate change. Involve both men and women in the prioritization and design of climate change adaptation projects. Okay. Further on, as a recommendation, new technologies should be appropriate to women's resources and demands. So we're simply saying, as people study and look at ways to mitigate and adapt to the effects of climate change, new technologies should be gender sensitive to both men and women. Extension of climate information services to women and men, especially indigenous communities who act as stewards of natural resources. Like I said earlier, women have primary knowledge and extensive knowledge of the environment, so that you should include women or play a critical role in as stewards of natural resources. Policy-making processes must include women's voices and involve them as agents of change. Make information, training, and technologies for climate change adaptation and mitigation accessible in an equitable way. Also improve the understanding of gender implications of climate change and of climate change policy. Further on, promote equal access to decision-making processes and new opportunities created by responses to climate change. Simply saying, if there are meetings and policies that look at ways and decisions to mitigate responses to climate change, they should involve both men and women. Even such gatherings, like the important ones, should also take into consideration gender, not just to include men, but involve both men and women. Investing in girls' education as a key strategy of reducing overall vulnerability to death and losses from climate-related disasters. This also ensures sustainable development to the impacts of climate change. Also promote equal access to new opportunities created by responses to climate change. So in conclusion, effective climate change adaptation should recognize that women, men, and children experience impacts differently depending on where they live, how they sustain their livelihoods, and the roles that they play in their families and communities. So for climate smart projects to succeed, women need to be promoted as agents of change. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Tendai, for such an elaborate and great presentation. I would like to open the floor for a brief emphasis on brief session of questions and discussion.
Thank you very much, ma'am, for a good presentation on gender. I was following, and I think, or I view as if you primarily focused much on women living out the bomb child. Your introduction is included both, but as you went down, I noticed that you focused much on women than the boy child, than men per se. In my understanding, there's been a wide voice for women to be part and parcel of the economy through in each and every aspect. And in my understanding, women have got more opportunities than men. And be that may, you find that, let's for example say, in set of firewood, you may find that men are also playing a critical role, which in most cases women are no longer doing that kind of job, not saying 100%, but the same thing with water. You get an example of Ferrari. The same thing, if you move around in the boreholes and so forth, you find men are driving around in search of water, depending who is available. But also, probably I would want to take it a bit further on the effects of climate change to the loss of jobs to men, the issue of infidelity caused by climate change as a result of poverty and hunger. The issue, roughly, I think you primarily looked more on women, forgetting the male aspect. Can you, I don't know how you are going to clarify or add the audience understand that part. Thank you.
Thank you. I just wanted to ask, you mentioned that women have
a low access to medical health compared to women. I just want to understand how.
I also wanted to add on to what you said. Sometimes women they don't keep certain livestock like cattle. So my question is, what really is the problem? Because what's stopping women from doing this gender neutral activities like chengeta ng'ombe? Why don't we chengeta huku chete? How is that problem affect our guys? Thank you.
Sorry, I didn't get which organization you're representing, so I don't know if you are the best place to answer my question. But my question is, are the policies for climate change management that are in place, do they recognize that gendered aspect of climate change effects, and how are they addressing them?
I think maybe you can have one more question and give them a chance to respond.
All right, thank you so much for your presentation. It was quite informative and interesting. Mine is not a question, it is a contribution to say that, by the way, my name is Lisa and I'm from Environmental Rights Advocacy Trust. So from the CSO sector, right, what we expect from you guys as journalists is that when such issues like gender come up, we need to work together for us to be able maybe to look at the policies and say when the NDC document was drafted, is it gender sensitive, or is it looking at issues of the youth, right? I understand your questions and where you're coming from, right? But I would like us to work together and ensure that we are able to ask, to write articles and ask some of those questions so that they can be changed at the end of the day. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for your questions. I'll try to answer the first question. The first speaker actually commented that the presentation focused more on the impact of climate change on women, ignoring issues that men face. I think would agree with me that the focus that is much focus on the impact of climate change over years has focused much more on men. Hence the need now to address the gaps that exist between men and women in relation to the impact of climate change. So we're not saying men are not important or men are not affected by the impact of climate change, but we're simply saying, yes, men are affected, but they're affected in an equitable way with women. So hence the need to focus more on the impact of climate change on women. And then the second question was on, someone said, how do women have socioeconomic status of women? Was it? Did I get that right?
No, the issue of small livestock.
Okay, the issue of livestock also. Thank you for that. I think the issue of livestock, especially in rural setup, we all know power dynamics that exist, especially in patriarchal societies, where men own the most valuable assets. So it's not like women don't want to own cattle, but it's because of less individual income. They have less individual income. Also, the lower socioeconomic status. So this actually prevents them from owning big assets such as cattle. So it's a matter of the power dynamics that exist, especially in these rural setups. Then on the issue of policies, on the issue of gender, I think policies are in place. There's actually a gender action plan document that was formulated by the ministry that actually articulates more of these issues to do with gender and and climate change. So policies are in place. I think that's all.
How do women have no access to medical health
Okay,
care?
or it's simply because of the socio-economic status of women. We know the barriers that women have. Looking at our setup in Zimbabwe, there are barriers. Women have over the years faced barriers to gain access to paying jobs, institutions of learning, although the government has quite addressed some of these challenges. For example, establishment of women's university, affirmative action in universities, abolishment of gender neutral roles in public institutions. So it's actually the low social economic status is actually the major reason why women have less access to medical facilities.
Okay, thank you very much. My name is Tendai Kwamombe. We were together since yesterday. My apology for lately coming to you. So my thinking here is that even Mr. Mashungu yesterday presented some of the key crucial documents, the likes of NDC, the Low Emissions Development Strategy. So my thinking here was that as journalists, we have to research further. We have to look into those documents and try to analyze various gender issues that have been elaborated in there. Just yesterday in the evening myself, I was going through the Low Emissions Development Strategy, and I figured out that there are 38 mitigation options, which are actual opportunities for women, even vulnerable groups and the likes. So I think as journalists, it's our job, it's our duty to research into those issues and try to see how women can tap into those various opportunities that are presented in the Low Emissions Development Strategy. So that was just my contribution. Thank you.
Thank you for that.
My apologies to cut us short. Because of time constraint, I think we can continue these discussions over tea break, and then we resume the program for the day. So thank you again, Mr. Knight, for the presentation, and if you can give a round of applause. Thank you.